עכשיו, כי זו הולכת להיות הרצאה מרתקת. מי שירצה זה פרופסור סבולצ מהונגריה, מהמכון לפסיכיאטריה והתמכרות בהונגריה. אנחנו יודעים שאירופה בעצם מאוד מאוד מוטרדת מכל הנושא של הפליטים, וזבולצ, פרופסור קרי, שחקר הרבה מאוד השפעות של פסיכופתולוגיה ומוח וגנטיקה, הרגיש באיזשהו שלב שצריך לעשות רגע עצירה ולראות גם מה קורה בשטח, ובעצם התפנה וחקר את כל הנושא של הפליטים, כל הנושא של טראומה בקרב פליטים, וזו זכות גדולה בשבילנו שהוא בא לכנס הזה, ואני בטוחה שתהנו מההרצאה שלו. אז פרופסור קרי.
To start it.
Do you want
Good.
the clicker? Do you want the clicker?
Yes, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today and to participate in this beautiful meeting, and my deep thanks to the organizers for inviting me. First of all, I would like to talk about something which is probably a historic event, despite the fact that it happened only 2 years ago. In 2015, hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers passed the border of Hungary to find their ways to Western Europe, especially to Germany, and probably this event led to the most significant political, social and moral crisis in Hungary since the Second World War. The majority of these people came from countries that are hit by war, political violence and oppression, and therefore the question was highly relevant what we can say about the post-traumatic symptoms, the PTSD symptoms in this population. This figure shows you the prevalence of PTSD and the number of traumatic events in people from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq and other countries. As you can see, the prevalence in the green chart, prevalence is quite high. Approximately 2/3 of the population reached the clinical threshold of PTSD. The bar chart also shows you a mean max values, which is from a meta-analysis of the literature, showing a huge range of the prevalence of PTSD in asylum seekers and refugees, from a few percent to up to 80%. It clearly means that alone an asylum seeker or a refugee status does not necessarily mean that he or she will suffer from PTSD, and individual and contextual factors must be taken into consideration. As a next step, we did a biological validation and transcultural comparison in this sample by using high-resolution brain imaging techniques and trying to take a look at the structural changes of the hippocampal formation. Probably the most well-replicated fact in the literature is that the hippocampal formation, which is responsible for memories, learning and emotional regulation, shows a decreased volume, a shrinkage in individuals with PTSD. However, as the colors shown in the figure, the hippocampus is not a homogeneous structure. There are small substructures in this tiny part of the brain, and some of them are more vulnerable to stress and others are less vulnerable to stress. Probably the dentate gyrus, which is a very funny name for the small part of the hippocampus, is the most vulnerable part. And this figure shows you how the volume of this small part is changed in people from Syria with PTSD, from other countries, and even in Hungarian civilians who were, of course, not yet refugees, but civilians who were exposed to different traumatic events. The red arrows show a homogeneous decrease in the volume of the small part of the hippocampus in people from Syria, other countries, and even in Hungarian civilians, showing a high level of transcultural similarity in brain responses, structural brain responses to trauma. The second most important step in the biological validation of PTSD is interestingly coming from our immune system. Our leukocytes circulating in our blood, not only protecting us against bacteria or viruses, they show a very, very strong and sensitive response to psychological stress and trauma by changing the expression of at least dozens of genes within these cells. This figure shows you a composite score from a blood test investigating the expression of 10 genes from leukocytes from people of Hungary, other countries, Iraq and Syria. And in this composite score, 100 is approximately the normal. As you can see, people with PTSD, whether they are from Hungary, from other countries, or for Syria, show a significant decrease in the pattern of the expression of genes, indicating that the immune system will respond to stress and trauma in a very similar manner in these different populations. So probably, and honestly speaking, this is the last scientific slide in my talk, at least from the viewpoint of clinical neurosciences and psychiatry. And in the second part of the talk, I would like to talk about more subjective aspects regarding follow-up study in this population. So the question was, after 2 years, what happened to these people? How they can cope, how they can deal with the trauma they experienced in their home countries, the secondary traumas they experienced during migration, and the huge social burden of adaptation to the new environment they live in. Probably social sciences are not able to draw such a beautiful picture about this question as art can do. This is a quotation for a novel. These are the names. This is the title of the novel, which makes an extremely nice balance between the painfully everyday aspects and the more spiritual and metaphysical aspects of being an outcast, of being a rejected person, being a member of a rejected group. Back to science a little bit. If we take a look at the key coping mechanisms in refugees and asylum seekers all around the world, very heterogeneous data show 4 consistent mechanisms to cope with. 2 of them are social and 2 of them are so-called cognitive mechanisms. The 2 social mechanisms are for, of course, seeking social support from the external environment, risk-taking behavior, which is a negative coping, and from a cognitive point of view, trying to forget, it's very prevalent, and the last one is turning to religion, which is probably the most interesting for us right now, for today. I think everybody in this audience is familiar with the wisdom of prophets. They know everything about how religion, how God can help in pain, in suffering, in desperation. But in addition to this ancient wisdom, we have some more modern, up-to-date knowledge from psychological sciences. Religion is something like an extraordinary meaning-making framework to explain, to help you comprehend everything which is beyond the normal everyday human experience, including traumas. In addition to this meaning-making framework, which is basically cognitive, it will provide positive social emotions of consolation, hope, and empowerment. When you experience these emotions, which makes a secondary control, a feeling of a secondary control, you cannot do a primary control, you cannot change the environment in these situations, but yet you can have the power to change yourself within. Secondary control. So beyond these secondary control mechanisms, always social emotions are linked to new social values that will promote community support and the cohesion of groups. And finally, probably the most powerful model to understand what's going on in religious activity is coming from the theories of psychological attachment. Almost all kinds of trauma, let it be a loss of another person who you loved, your material values or your abstract values, your idols, can be conceptualized as a disrupted attachment. So it's very logical, bonding to a supernatural power that is omnipotent, omniscient, cannot be disrupted, cannot die, is a very, very safe mechanism to find consolation, strength, and hope. So now we have a modern psychological toolbox to understand why religion is important, including a meaning-making framework, the secondary control, social emotions, and attachment. It sounds very great. But there is an interesting twist and turn in the story. And this interesting twist and turn in the story is that a huge number of dominantly Muslim refugees and migrants in Europe started to convert to Christianity, which is a very surprising phenomenon. Unfortunately, the exact numbers are not known, but it is highly indicative that the German Evangelical Church published a guideline, a textbook for pastors how to baptize these Muslim asylum seekers. And according to some public reports, these baptisms are held in public swimming pools instead of River Jordan, which is also a very interesting phenomenon. This daisy written slide shows you many examples from Europe, not only from Germany, but from Netherlands, from the United Kingdom, suggesting that at least thousands of Muslim people start to convert to Christianity. According to Matthew Kieming, who is a professor of theology in Seattle, and who conducted a field study, a Dutch field study, Muslim refugees will be the one who bring new life to the churches of Europe. The churches of Europe, the Christian churches of Europe, are dying. Europeans are secularized, lazy, wealthy, and not really interested in spiritual issues, in contrast to the newcomers, Muslim refugees. However, there is a bold contrast, in addition to this bold statement, a contrasting view, claiming by public persons, politicians, but even some social scientists, that these religious conversions are not really genuine. They are not really true. They are driven by personal interest, for example, to get the refugee status, or simply to get financial support from the Christian churches. So, what is the truth? I would argue that the distinction between genuine and non-genuine conversion is not justified and not useful for psychological sciences, I would like to polarize it, the bold statement. Even these conversions are deceptions. These deceptions are important for us to investigate with scientific tools to better understand what's going on in Europe. But if you take a look at advanced social decision-making models, taking into consideration the risk-benefit ratio of such a decision to convert, the picture is even much more complicated. People who decide to convert to Christianity take a quite high risk. They will be discriminated by the huge Muslim fellows, the groups. They will be discriminated in their home countries. And in this case, it is not only a social rejection. It can be a physical penalty, it can be jail, and it can be death in some Muslim countries. And we shouldn't forget that many of these people left a part of their family behind in their home country. That's a very confusing phenomenon. And finally, this is the final one, the standpoint and the viewpoint of pastors, is that religion is not really about dogmas, it's not really about beliefs, it's not really about ideas, it's about practice. It's about taking part in the life of the community, to start to sing together, to start to pray together, to listen to the gospel, and finally the internal changes will follow these behavior patterns. This is called the belief-behavior sequence of changes in social sciences. It's an interesting thing. This kind of distinction between genuine and non-genuine conversion is not really supported by Christian theology. And it will be very surprising for many people, because one may think that it's about clearness in the soul, honesty, try to be a saint, try to be a perfect person if you turn to the church. But if you take a look at this quotation, which is from Paul, probably one of the most important apostles, and his letters to the Philippians, which is a key text in the Christian Bible, the bold statement can be seen. The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. That's surprising, and it seems that even those ages, it was an important issue to discriminate between genuine and non-genuine conversion. Okay. So it's much better, instead of these genuine and non-genuine distinctions, to make some kind of definition for different kinds of factors participating in religious conversion. And so far, we're talking about these external mechanisms serving social cohesion, functioning, belonging to a productive support system, and adaptation, although superficially, to social values. These are associated with internal mechanisms, internal factors for psychological well-being, consolation of past events, forgiveness, and hope. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is not so important for us. What is important for us is the so-called transpersonal factor of religious conversion. This is a real psychological crisis, a very painful process, and it is characterized by radical changes in self-identity, meaning, and life. Secular attributions are replaced by religious ones, and ideas and feelings related to religious things, which can be found in the periphery of the consciousness of these individuals, will be the center of their consciousness. Some of these individuals will experience very unusual experiences, very unusual feelings, which are called in psychopathology psychosis-like experiences. It is very important to underline that religious conversion is not madness. This is not psychosis, which has borrowed terms from psychopathology to use them to describe phenomena which are extraordinary and which can be useful for us to better understand what's going on here. To understand what are these unusual experiences, probably the best way to do is to focus on a critical term called depersonalization. Depersonalization, which is a part of an unusual sense of self. In depersonalization, your autobiographical memories seem to be quite distant, strange, alien. The boundaries between your personal memories are blurred. The time-space context of these memories are disrupted, leading to the feeling of very, very strange change in you. Physically, if you take a look at the mirror, for example, it's a typical clinical phenomenon, you may feel that somebody else is watching at you from this mirror. And sometimes this kind of change in the self-experience can be tracked at the level of somatosensory perception, proprioception, perception of our body. The other main dimension, perplexity, is much more general, and it refers to well-defined changes in perceptual threshold leading to visual and auditory overloading, not real hallucinations, but illusions, changes in attentional weighting, what is important to attend, what is not important to attend, and changes in salience processing. Okay, so now we have a complex knowledge about what's going on in religious conversion from the viewpoint of psychology, and here is the key hypothesis. Let's say that these Muslim refugees who were converted to Christianity use external factors. Real conversion is not important, just social adaptation, and in this case we may expect that in deep interviews, deep clinical interviews, narrative interviews, we will not find enhanced prayer activity related to Christianity, and of course we will not see these strange, unusual experiences in self and perplexity. Here we go with the findings very, very shortly. This figure shows you points, rating scale points from two independent raters who evaluated interviews from these subjects, showing unusual self-experiences in converters, non-converters, perplexity in converters, and key topics related to the Christian conversion. The figure shows a linear relationship between the level of trauma exposition, low, medium, and high, and the intensity of unusual self-experiences, perplexity, and key topics related to Christianity. I also found a significant decrease in PTSD symptoms and depressive symptoms in these individuals before conversion versus conversion in both self-rating scales and rater scores who were blind to the status of these individuals. Yet this data should be interpreted very cautiously because it is from a cross-sectional study and it is pure retrospective report of the participants. Okay, skip it. So, signs of intrinsic conversion. They have an altered sense of self and perplexity. Converters show enhanced prayer and critical topics related to Christian religion, and all these phenomena are associated with trauma exposition, but only in converters. Who are these people? Many of them young and male people with a family, that's an interesting finding, and they have a religious history, a previous encounter with Christian religion. You know, if you go to refugee camps in Turkey or in Lebanon, it's a shocking experience to see that broadcasting stations and agents advertise Islamic Jihad on the one hand, and the same agents and same broadcasting stations advertise Jesus Christ. So it's a very, very insane situation. Also, it is well known from the literature that trauma survivors often show guilt, a feeling of guilt and sin. This is the guilt and sin of survivors, and it can be relieved after religious conversion. So to conclude, There is multiple lines of evidence that a significant number of Muslim asylum seekers convert to Christianity in Europe. They are dominantly young, religiously primed and trauma-exposed individuals, and as we could say, they have mixed external, internal, and transpersonal factors related to conversion, including a significant number and intensity of unusual experiences related to self-transformation. Therefore, the hypothesis of a pure external type of conversion are not supported, are not justified by these investigations. That's all for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Will you please sit down there so we can discuss? Okay, I wish to call a D. Cantol from the INSS, who will respond to this talk.
Thank you very much, Sbulcz, for a fascinating and important lecture, which I definitely learned a lot from, and I think it's a very important issue for all of us, especially today, especially after 2015, the big wave of immigrants arriving to Europe. The study on PTSD, and more precisely on the ways of coping with PTSD among refugees entering Europe, has grown, especially since 2015, with the so-called wave of refugees and asylum seekers entering the continent from various places, and mainly from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and African countries. It became bigger. This is indeed the largest wave of human displacement since World War II, this we know today already, where persecution has forced more than 60 million people. These are men, women, and children. This number needs to be repeated all the time. 60 million right at this moment seeking a refuge and home. And people who had to flee from their homeland in search of security and a better future. In my opinion, the most important lesson from the panel today on the issue of refugees in Europe is the following. Is the mass migration the world is witnessing today is not only a temporary state of emergency, which many of the people would like to think, but a beginning of a new reality. And this is something that I think all of us have to take under consideration, which requires decent and profound care, both by state actors and by us, the scholarly community. So the men, women, and children who have suffered from continuous and repeating traumatic events until they reach safety are now in Europe, and this is a plain fact, and have to deal and cope with their traumatic past, and their surrounding, namely the European community, must offer them the help they need, not only for the refugees themselves, which is of course the main concern, but also for the sake of the European community itself and its identity as such, if it wants to be liberal, democratic, and human, and enlightened and enlightening, as it wanted to be since 1945. Professor Judith Herman, in her groundbreaking study on trauma and recovery from 1992, it's a really groundbreaking study, showed us that it's not only enough to understand the trauma itself, but we must take under consideration the aftermath of traumatic event, the PTSD, and invest time and research on this as well if we want to understand human behavior as a whole better. In her book, Herman refers to one factor which was so decisive in coping with the past by many victims of trauma: finding a meaning in things you do. Yeah, victims of trauma, when they find a meaning in what they do, it helps them recover better. This we know from Professor Herman. Her study and other studies as well have suggested that once victims find meaningful activity, they're busy with which they're busy. After experiencing trauma, they recover better and they find ways of coping better with their traumatic past. If whether in community activities, political engagement, as long as they're coping with meaningful purpose, this is already one step forward, forward to recovery. So why do I mention Professor Herman and trauma and recovery in this groundbreaking book? Because this specific point can be well connected with your study, Professor Carey. Your findings on religious conversion among Muslim refugees. After fleeing from the most horrific situation, these people have the need to find a meaning in what they're doing, in who they are, and to give a sense to life again. After they've lost everything, they've lost the people they knew, their families, their homeland. They need to find a meaning now to life. And they found it, according to your research, in Christianity, in religious conversion. And according to your findings, these were not only the external mechanisms which made them convert, but rather the internal and the transpersonal, as you suggested before, mechanisms as well, which played an important role in their decision. So it wasn't really not only the support of the community or the material needs, if I understood you correctly, the material needs or the getting shelter, food, etc., that made them want to convert, or getting financial support, which we might expect that this would be maybe the main factor that would make them, or to inspire them to convert, but rather more internal factors, internal mechanisms and processes, redefining sense of self, finding your inner God, personal God. And I think these findings are astonishing. I was very, very surprised. I expected, maybe because of other researches that I've read, that it was more the material need, but I was very, very surprised to understand that it's not the only factor. And I know I have very, very short time. I just wrote a few questions that I think are interesting for discussion. I don't know if we have the time for discussion, but maybe in the break, that come from your very important research, which I really thank you for. How much is it a social phenomenon, this religious conversion? How much, to what extent can we refer to this as a social phenomenon? What are the numbers that we are talking about here? Is there a growing tendency in Europe? This is something that definitely was interesting for me to know. We talked a little bit about it yesterday also, the issue of gender. You said in your findings that these are more young men with family who find the need to convert. I was very interested to know, more concerning the distinction between men and women. Were there more men doing it or more women, and if so, why? You said they also had family. Family affected their decision to convert. To what extent were they religious before? Does the fact that these people were religious before affect, had an influence on their decision to do that? I was also very interested to know what were the inner reactions within the community of migrants. How did the people who did not convert, how did they react to those who did? Were there tensions? I presume there were. Even more than tensions. Sometimes I'm sure that they were also threatened. It was life and death threat. Do you believe, Professor Carey, that this conversion assisted them in their assimilation process in your case, Hungarian society, or the German society, or the Austrian, or the Polish society? Does it really help them assimilate better? Are they resilient? I think this is maybe the concluding question. We're talking about resilience today and social resilience. Are they the fact that they converted, does it mean that they are more resilient now or less resilient now? I have a lot of course, more questions, but I know my time is short. Just to sum it up, I think your research is very, very important also to us Israelis to understand the role of religious conversion in our society, what happens to migrants and refugees who are coming to Israel and their will to convert. How much does it help them in assimilating and better integrating in the society? So thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers.
תודה רבה, אנחנו יוצאים עכשיו